This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Paul Slovic. He's the founder and president of Decision Research. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. He studies human judgment, decision-making, and risk analysis. He and his colleagues worldwide have developed methods to describe risk perceptions and measure their impacts on individuals, industry, and society. Paul digs right into the heart of the matter: risk. Whether your daily life, an entrepreneurial venture, you're trading and investing, risk is paramount. But it's more than just risk. And this is what Paul is known for: risk perception. So how can we use Paul's risk and risk perception insights to our own benefit? That's where we dig in today. But first, before I get into our conversation, I want to read a few of the major theories behind Paul's work. Number one, the affect heuristic. This is the ability to make a quick emotional decision in time of crisis. Paul says that if there is a bad situation, if we have positive feelings towards something, it lowers people's perception of risks, but enhances their perception of benefits. A huge point. We talk about that today. Number two, Paul has contributed towards the psychometric paradigm of risk perception. He found that people usually perceived most activities as having a high risk. He also found that if someone gained pleasure from something, they saw the risk level being low. This shows that risk levels can depend on the individual's personal belief and emotions of a specific risk. Lastly, psychophysical numbing. This is the idea that people are not affected by the loss of life depending on how it is presented. Paul says that people cannot connect on an emotional level when they are being presented with large numbers. Think about genocide, and that's something we talk about today. Think about genocide on a worldwide basis in the last 50 years. Hitler was not the only one. It's never stopped. Now, you might only be interested in trading and investing, and you might say, why does this matter? You're asking the wrong question. This is a conversation about risk and risk perception. What is the divergence between risk and risk perception? We can have the actual risks. We can measure those. We can put probabilities on those. But what happens when you add the emotional component? The conversation becomes much different. Finally, I want to implore you to take a look at a white paper by Paul Slovic called Perception of Risk. It is easily found. It was published in the Science Journal. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Paul Slovic. Specifically, risk, but even more specifically, risk versus perception of risk. I know that's right in your wheelhouse. It's where I'd like to start today, and I would love for you to put your best professorial hat on and let you explain risk versus perception of risk to my audience.
Well, I think for a long time, people didn't distinguish between those two concepts. There was just risk, and some people were smart about risk and knew about it, and others didn't. And we tended to defer fully to experts to tell us what the so-called real risks were about something that concerned us in our environment, like nuclear power plants or certain types of diseases or whatever. I sort of backed into this slowly through studying risk-taking in decision-making about simple gambles, and then I was asked some questions about how does this relate to risk in the world, and I started to look at that through experiments.
I kind of jumped right in with the heavy question, but I think maybe even the better place to begin is the beginning. What were some of your first inspirations and the first light bulb moments that had your career going down this risk direction and then this risk perception direction? I think that'd be fascinating. I'd love to know.
When I went to graduate school, I was interested in studying personality theory and personality assessment, but I was given a job as a research assistant to a professor named Clyde Coombs, who happened to be doing a study on choices among gambles. And I thought, well, I've never seen any psychology research that looked at bet preferences, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Started to kind of follow in that same direction and started doing research in a similar nature with that professor. And it wasn't that he was studying gambling per se, like, what do people do in Las Vegas. He was using gambles as a way to study economic theories about how people make decisions under risk and how they process information about probabilities and positive and negative payoffs and this sort of thing. You want to know how in the mind we integrate information about a situation that offers us some chance to win, some chance to lose, some amount to win, some amount to lose. So that's what he was studying, and then I started to do that as well. I did that throughout my career as a graduate student at the University of Michigan. I switched the following year to another professor. It turned out there was two professors at the University of Michigan where I was who were studying choices among gambles. Rather odd type of research, but both of them were at Michigan. And the other one was Ward Edwards. I switched to him and worked with him throughout the rest of my graduate student career. Then I got a job out here in Eugene, Oregon, at a research institute, and I continued along that vein, doing experiments on gambles. A gamble is kind of like to decision-making people, like the fruit fly was to biologists. It was something that you could study and to try to learn about basic processes that might generalize, beyond the particular thing that you were studying. So the gamble sort of embodies the fundamental elements of a risk situation, probabilities and payoffs. We studied this. Then this was throughout the 1960s. Around the late 1960s or 1970 or so, I was introduced to a geographer named Gilbert White, who had done some of the first studies of risk perception, what was called risk perception, and he was interested in natural hazards. So I think he was the first person really to study risk perception. He would go out in the floodplain or in areas susceptible to earthquakes and question people about their understanding and their perception of the risks that they were facing against the natural environment. I met him, and he started to ask me questions. He said, well, you've been studying these gambles for 10 years. Maybe you can help me understand some things that are puzzling to me. Like, why is it that when people get flooded out, after the flood, they return right to the same spot and rebuild and expose themselves again to the flood? Why don't they, respect the floodplain and stay away? And I said, well, we never actually studied that in our, laboratory experiments. And they said, well, I have another question. Is it true that if the consequences of being exposed to or of taking a risk happen, farther out in time, they're delayed in time, would you be more likely to take a risk if the consequences are distant in time? And I said, well, we never exactly studied that either. So in our laboratory studies, and question after question about what was going on in the real world, we hadn't really studied, but I got interested in that and started to think, well, maybe we should be studying these sorts of questions. And then right about the same time, in the early 70s, things started to heat up in terms of concern about certain technological risks, like nuclear power in particular, had been coming on strong, and there are a lot of reactors that had been built recently, and many people were concerned about the risks of nuclear power and didn't want any more nuclear power plants built, and there was a big debate about whether they were safe or not. We decided, my colleagues Baruch Fischoff, Sarah Lichtenstein, and I decided that maybe we ought to start to look into those sorts of of risks and questioned people about them. And so this led to a change in our direction from laboratory studies to what we called study of societal risk-taking. That included then these questions about perception. And it was called perception of risk when the public was responding. So we started to look both at the public, and we did an early study comparing them to risk experts, people who professionally made judgments and decisions about risk and studied risk. And we found some strong differences between the public and the experts. The public, in one study, our participants from the public had nuclear power as the risk of most concern to them in society, and the experts had this 22nd out of a list of 30. So a big difference. And on the other hand, there was another radiation technology, the use of medical X-rays, that the public was unconcerned about, and the experts had that relatively high in terms of what they thought was the risk to the public because of exposure to radiation. So here you had two radiation technologies that there was big differences between the public and the experts, but they went in opposite directions for nuclear power and for X-rays. And then we started to look more closely at that, and we asked people questions about not only how risky do you think something is and how beneficial do you think the activity is, but also we had them characterize these risk situations or risk technologies on a variety of dimensions that had been hypothesized as being important in influencing people's concern about risk, specifically whether you were exposed to the risk voluntarily or not, or whether it was imposed upon you involuntarily, whether the risk evoked an emotional feeling like dread, whether the risk could affect future generations or just kind of had immediate consequences, a variety of questions like this. We found that not only did people's concern about nuclear power was greater than X-rays, but that these two radiation hazards had very different profiles across these qualities or dimensions of risk, like voluntariness, or another important dimension was whether there was potential for a catastrophic outcome. So people saw the possibility that there could be a catastrophic accident with nuclear power, not so much with medical X-rays, at least at the societal level. We then learned that hazards had personalities, kind of like people did. Defined by how they looked on these dimensions of risk. We then understood that not only did people see nuclear power as more risky than something like X-rays, but nuclear power was also seen as less voluntary, less controllable, more potentially catastrophic, more likely to be fatal, and things like that led to their concern.
Most of my audience will have a decent feeling of risk from a probabilistic standpoint, things that I'll talk about a lot and other guests will talk about for the definition of risk. But the definition of perception of risk, it's really taking reason plus emotion. And somebody asked me about my conversation with you today, and they wanted to kind of a general overview. And I said, well, think about like this. Somebody smart, like my father, he's a doctor, and he understands flying on an airplane. He understands the probabilities, but he's got the emotional side that says, I don't want to get on the airplane. And I think that's where the risk perception starts to come into play. And then if you start to expand that out upon different individuals, different cultures, different nations, risk perception can vary greatly, can it?
Yes. And the emotion, the aspect of emotion was kind of left out of the definition of risk, our understanding of risk for a long time. My colleagues and I think, were among the first to try to bring it into the study of risk, and we made the distinction between risk as a feeling and risk as a result of analysis or calculation. And what we've come to appreciate is that the human mind processes information in two very different modes that Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, who I think you have interviewed, talks about fast and slow thinking. That's been a very important revelation to bring into the study of risk perception, is that we react to, when we think about risk, we have kind of an immediate gut reaction, and often it stops there. I mean, that we trust that it seems right to us, and we go with that. If it's something scares us, we avoid it, and if it doesn't, and it has benefits, we don't worry about it, and we take those benefits. In many cases, we need to go beyond that, because these first impressions, emotional impressions, can be misleading. We need to think more carefully and more analytically about the risk. We need to kind of do the math in a sense and consider the probabilities and weigh the consequences by the probabilities. That's what the scientists, technical people, tend to do, and that's very important. And if we shortcut that and only rely on our feelings, a lot of times we'll be okay, but sometimes we'll make very serious mistakes. And so some of our research in recent years has looked at some of the mistakes that come from relying on this, quote, what we call the feeling of risk.
Trying to win the public over to a better understanding of risk is very difficult if one doesn't attempt to understand their perception of risk, if one doesn't attempt to understand the emotion of risk, if those are left out by the regulators, the policymakers, the politicians, and one just keeps preaching the numbers and the statistics, that doesn't go over very well, does it?
No, and the most of the communication about risk over the years has been what we call one way. It's the experts telling the public what they should or should not be worried about, or how much they should be concerned, or the fact that maybe they shouldn't be concerned about something that they were protesting or worrying about. It's not just the feelings that are involved here. Going back to this earlier work where we found these qualities or dimensions of risk that were important, like whether it was under your own control or whether it had a catastrophic outcome potential, that these qualities really were linked to values. How important is the possibility of a catastrophic outcome, and how much weight should that get in a decision? If the probability is very low, but the consequences could be very great, how do you integrate those? It's not obvious. There's no obvious right formula for doing that. And so that links to how you define risk, the very basic element of definition. And what we found in our early work was that the experts had a much simpler definition of risk than the public. For the experts, risk was some combination of the likelihood of something happening and how bad or dangerous was it. So you kind of multiplied the consequences by the probability of their occurring, and that was kind of the key quantity that told you how risky it was. And what we realized from our perception studies was that that probability times consequence equation was leaving out these qualities that people felt that were important, and that you couldn't just automatically dismiss as being irrational. The fact that the risk might be passed on to future generations, or the fact that the risk was not under someone's control. That it was being imposed on people involuntarily. These were things that were relevant to people's assessments of risk that were being left out of this simple equation. They were not necessarily irrational. They had to be kind of on the table when you had, discussions and communications about risk. They were legitimate. It doesn't mean that, the public was necessarily always right or the experts wrong. Not at all. But they needed to be considered in any serious discussions of risk.
Talk about the role that media plays in perception of risk amongst the public.
Well, the media has a huge impact on our perceptions. Fortunately, we don't have to learn firsthand about many of the risks in the world, and particularly if they're low probability, we don't encounter them that often individually. Although society may, over a large population, they may occur with some frequency, but for any individual, they're rare. So we learn about the world of risk to a great extent through the media. It used to be that by the media I meant reading the newspaper. Well, that's certainly changed in today's world. Then there came to be television, which was a dominant form of media. Now we've got all the other sorts of electronic media that are equally, if not more important. So that's where we hear about things. That's where we communicate with our friends about risk, or they tell us about it. And on the internet, everyone seems to be an expert. So it's hard to discriminate between people who are, really technically expert and other people who just are, sound like they're experts but really aren't. The media is tremendously important. The media also has its own kind of rules about what they think people want to hear about, and so they're often biased in the way they present things. You hear a lot more about the media cover more things like homicides, for example, more than suicides. Okay, but even though suicides are more frequent in some populations, what you hear about is the homicides, and so if people tend to think that their perceptions are very much influenced by the relative frequency in the media, which is often not completely accurate with the frequency in the that these things occur. So things that are sensational, dramatic, get more media coverage and influence our perceptions. But another thing that influences our perceptions, linked to media reports, is what we call the signal value of an event, of a risk event, and this comes out of a theory that geographer Roger Kasperson and colleagues created in 1988 called the social amplification of risk, and what that theory describes is how when something bad occurs, a risk event, and it gets reported, you see the report covers the facts of what happened, what went wrong, how many people were injured or killed, how much property was damaged. Those were kind of the basic facts. But people look at the story, they either read it or hear it on TV or some other media, and then they try to kind of read between the lines to see, is there another story lurking, behind the facts here about that has to do kind of with the likelihood that this event will recur, that this event is going to be increasingly frequent, in our world, things like that. We call that the signal value. The likelihood that this event is a signal for more and worse things to come.
Riskiness means more to people than the expected number of fatalities. There's something deeper going on. Exactly.
And I think the most dramatic example of this in the last decade or so was the attacks on 9/11, terrorist attack on 9/11, where it was pretty serious. You had several airplanes destroyed, and the Twin Towers, and 3,000 or 4,000 people died, and that's pretty severe. Following that, we've had kind of a $1 trillion of repercussions in society and of all kinds. Airport screening and other kinds of security consciousness, and all restrictions on certain freedoms when we fly and so forth. So a lot comes, what we call those ripple effects the direct damage, as bad as it was just the inner circle of a rippling process that ripples out to society in many ways, and often can carry far greater costs than the direct damages themselves. And this is all triggered in part by the signal of the event, and I think the huge signal of the 9/11 event was vulnerability. Here the most powerful nation in the history of the world could be brought into some form of chaos by a handful of men in a few minutes. Could have that kind of shock to our national sense of well-being, that we were thus vulnerable to this kind of thing, and that vulnerability then triggers an immense reaction to try to control that risk.
Yeah, that ripple from 9/11, I think, can easily be argued changed the course of the United States of America
and the world. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let me ask about something from earlier in your career that you brought up, and I'm curious if you've had an expanded thought process about it or expanded ideas, specifically nuclear power. So early on, you have so many people not seeing the benefits, but seeing the extreme risks. And clearly in your work, you say, hey, we do have to pay attention to the public's risk perception. We do have to listen to them. They're not going to always be right, but there's some wisdom in there. There's some errors in there. But now, looking at the Japanese nuclear crisis, I wonder how the example of nuclear power would have been perceived in the 1970s, now facing this most recent crisis in Japan. It might have been a different discussion for nuclear power.
Do you mean different in terms of more negative, or is that what you're thinking?
Well, I don't know. I'm just looking at it as a data point, that accident is a data point, and just wondering how things might have shaken out.
We had on a far lesser scale, the 3 Mile Island incident, which I believe was in 1979, and that was very devastating for nuclear power. Even though the experts would say that that kind of was a very much controlled situation. That is, there was a partial meltdown of the core material, but it was contained. Almost all of it was contained within the containment vessel, just as it was supposed to. That's why they built these containment around the reactor core is so that if to prevent releases from getting into the environment in any great amount. And so they said, yeah, sure, it was a problem, and we didn't know how to control it at first, but the backup system, the containment system, worked as planned. So in that sense, they would say, well, this shouldn't have been that big a deal. Well, it was a huge thing. It basically guaranteed that there weren't going to be any more nuclear power plants built for decades. It fed right into the concerns that people had that nuclear power was, catastrophically risky. And that, so Fukushima would have, been even more of a an event in that direction to kind of, the death knell of nuclear power. But one of the things that comes out of the recent work on risk as feeling is that risk and benefit are kind of fused in our mind in terms of an overall feeling towards, say, a risky technology, so that we look to how comfortable we feel with it, or how much we like or want something, and then we derive risk and benefit from that. So if we like a technology, where we see it as high in benefit and low in risk. If we dislike it, we see it as low in benefit and high in risk. The feeling often comes first and drives our judgments of risk and benefit. Well, that's very important. What it says is that if the benefit is appreciated and seen as very, very great, we will see the risk as lower and accept the risk. And what we have now is, the beginnings of looking at nuclear power in in a different light with regard to climate change risks. It's and the risk of alternative sources of energy that burn fossil fuels. So now, to the extent that we come to appreciate that nuclear power, does have this benefit of, it doesn't burn fossil fuels and contribute to climate change, we see it in a more positive light. This will dampen our feeling of risk, because risk and benefit are kind of fused here. Higher benefit then leads to lower perception of risk. And so that's an interesting thing that's happening now. It hasn't really tipped the balance strongly yet in favor of nuclear power, and maybe because of Fukushima recently, but it has the potential as we more and more see the problems that fossil fuel use is giving to causing for the environment, and get a new perception of the benefit of nuclear power. I think there'll be more tolerance of its risk and more acceptance of nuclear power.
Well, I'm calling you from Asia today, and I was in Beijing a few months ago, and I really like visiting China. The people are great, but there's some real issues with pollution. It's something that's not that the people themselves are going to get upset eventually. They're going to say, "Hey, we can't live here. This is really bad."
Yeah, I was in Beijing, and for a while I couldn't see 200 meters in front of me. It was so the air was so polluted. Yeah, I agree.
You bring up something about risk and benefit, and I can think of several examples. I had a gentleman on my podcast who loved to skydive. I've never skydived, and he just loved it. And so he's done it. He's comfortable with it. The risk to him is much lower. The benefit's huge. I can think of my situation. Give me a stage. I will talk to a crowd. I'll talk to an audience because I feel like there's a great benefit that comes to me. But most people don't want to stand on a stage and talk to an audience that the fear and the risk is so great, they can't even get to the point of seeing the benefit. And it really strikes me about your research is I think that's really what you're driving at, and one of the many things you're driving at. Exactly.
But of course, if you do get up on that stage, and you may be very very nervous and afraid the first time, and then you see, it went pretty well. The audience liked what I had to say. I got a lot of applause and later comments, and then and that positivity then comes in and dampens out, and reduces the anxiety or fear. And if that happens a few times over time, then it transforms the experience and the feelings. You no longer feel anxious, and then you see this as a positive, enjoyable, beneficial kind of thing. And that's the thing, that these fears are not. It's not once and for all always the same. It's they're learned through experience. If you have the opportunity to actually experience the thing that's frightening you, and it goes a different way, your system adjusts and learns. But then there are other things that you don't directly experience, like nuclear power plants. I mean, when a reactor operates safely for a day and produces a lot of power, there's how many positive events are that? You don't hear, first you don't hear about it. It's not news, so there's no experience that way, and it's just you don't get that positive experience. The lights go on, and you have power and stuff, but you don't attribute it to the safe and effective operation of the local nuclear power plant. But if something goes wrong in a plant, even a minor thing, it's big news. So then you experience the negatives and not the positives. That's another problem that kind of maintains the level of concern in a activity or technology, even when things are going well and it's quite beneficial. And another thing that we learned from our work is that bad is stronger than good. If something goes wrong in the system, it decreases our trust in the management of that system more than when something goes right. Something goes right, it doesn't really boost our trust and confidence. It's the negative outweighs the positive, and the negative is being conveyed to us much more frequently and forcefully through the media than the positive is. So those things are kind of challenges to appreciating the benefits and risks from modern technological systems that we don't experience directly, like you experience when you get up on the stage. So we learn through the media. It's another aspect of the way the media influences us is by focusing on bad news, and also our psychology is wired such that bad news has more effect on us than good news. It's probably something that a survival mechanism through the course of evolution, that we're more sensitive, to something that might harm us than to something that might help us.
I have a question that I think the audience might be scratching their head initially and saying, why is this relevant to Paul? But I think your explanation will illuminate, why do we as people in 2015, why do we ignore genocide?
Well, that's a critical question, obviously, that I slowly evolved an interest in over a number of years and a number of experiences and observations. I think this goes back to this feeling system, the what we call the fast mode of thinking that relies on our feelings. The feeling system evolved to protect us as individuals. That's how we kind of sense whether our environment was safe. Is this noise in the bushes an animal that's dangerous? Is the water, does it look safe to drink? Does it taste okay? We kind of trusted our senses and our feelings, and that was essential for survival. We didn't have to worry about risk to large populations somewhere else in the world. It wasn't relevant to survival. It was just about us and the people right around us. And so many millions of years later, we still have that element in our brain that reacts that way. And the thing about the feeling system is it doesn't scale up very well. That if you're relying just on your gut feelings, the difference between the very first life at risk is immensely important. 0 to 1 is huge. But if there are 87 people at risk or 88 people at risk that you hear about, you don't feel any different when you hear that there's 88 people threatened than 87. That one life that is so important when it's the very first and only life you're thinking about loses its importance when statistically as the numbers increase. The feeling system just doesn't get it. It doesn't scale up. That's where we need to use the other way of thinking, the analytic way of thinking, which says, wait a minute, the difference between 87 and 88 lives is one life. That's important, and we need to be sensitive to that difference, even against the backdrop of a larger tragedy. And so now when you hear thousands or millions, again, it's the same thing. Unless you think about the reality behind those statistics, you don't feel the reality, unless you think harder, take information you have about individual victims and then kind of try to scale it up in your mind to the statistical reality. But that's hard work, and we tend not to do that. The feeling system is very sophisticated. That's the way we navigate through our day. Making all kinds of decisions that are less important to the world, but important to us personally. How we get through the day is judging on with our feelings, but it doesn't scale up to large numbers of people at a distance from us, things like that. We don't feel that. We have to think about it another way. You have to look at the numbers, think hard about them, and the reality that they represent. And that's a challenge for educating ourselves, and for the media too. And we respond to strong stories like the story of Aylan Kurdi, the little boy who was found on the beach in Turkey, trying to flee from Syria, that went around the world because it was an individual, that caught us emotionally very powerfully and helped us, at least for a moment in time, to understand the reality of the tragedy that is unfolding, and it has been unfolding for years in that part of the world. We need these firsthand stories. That's a major element. More recently, I've been thinking about another psychological foible that also contributes to our underreacting to these large-scale humanitarian catastrophes, and that has to do with decision-making by our top leaders, people who command a lot of power in governments that could intervene and in strong ways, and they have to decide whether to intervene and to try to create safe zones or stop this slaughter in Syria versus other objectives. There's always other objectives that are sometimes in conflict, and in today's world there's what we call the most prominent objective is national security. We could be more forceful in our intervention in Syria, but there are countering factors, in terms of it might actually decrease our national security in various ways by stirring up even greater terrorist animosity towards us. It could, it has risks to our military. It has monetary costs that are great. We've got other uses for our money. So all of these things are competing objectives with saving lives, and these competing objectives tend to be dominant in the decision making because when you make a decision like this, you have to defend it to the public and the world. If we more forcefully and aggressively intervene, say in Syria, we have to have a good reason for doing that, and saving thousands of nameless, faceless people is not as good a reason as not acting in order to protect various security objectives that we have. As much as we say we value these distant lives, those values collapse in the decision making when they have to come up against things like security objectives, which dominate. So that's yet another aspect of psychology and decision making that leads us to underreact to the enormous humanitarian crisis that we're now facing.
One last point along this lines, and this is by no means is a negative thought against U.S. military or guys and gals in the armed forces, but I can think of two situations in my mind, and I'm calling you from Saigon tonight, and I've been in and out of this region for a couple years, and of course, most Americans know that approximately 60,000 men and women were killed in Vietnam, U.S. soldiers and other people with the military. A significant number, and I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a monument, and everyone's name is on it, and that's what we hear in America. And then you come to a place like Vietnam, and you realize, hold on. We weren't the only ones that lost people. They lost 5 million. And so then if you take that story and then you jump ahead to Iraq, and everyone knows how many American military guys and gals died. I think it was less than 10,000. But no one knows how many Iraqis died. And I'm not trying to be just bleeding hard or criticize America. I'm just saying when you put yourself in a different perspective and really look at these numbers and start to figure out a way to scale up, it's very difficult. When I ask that question, how does one stop genocide in 2015? And we don't know how to do it, do we? Obviously
not. Not that it's easy, but I think that the first step is to understand ourselves in some way, the self-contradictory values that we hold. I think we have the naive view that if we think something is important, we will act accordingly. and most of us think that preventing or stopping the slaughter of innocent people, even though it's in thousands of miles away, it's still we give that as a very high value. We think it's wrong, and we think it's important to stop it. But what we don't then realize is that what the obstacles to our acting in accordance with our beliefs actually are. That we have to then first fully appreciate the importance of stopping this, because in the lives that are being destroyed and how horrible that is. We have to fully appreciate that. And second, we have to realize how we have to then structure our decision-making processes that don't let the humanitarian values fall off the table because they can't compete against national security. We have to, and so there are techniques in the domain of what's called decision analysis that try to get people to think more carefully about, if you value one life this greatly, how should we value, 400,000 lives or 700,000 lives, and to kind of do it in a more structured way to help to guide the decision makers to make decisions that are faithful to their values and not easily thrown off track by the fact that it's more defensible not to act than to act in terms of the political defenses. So I think that's the hope, is that by understanding the weird way that we think about these risks, we might be able to make decisions that are more more rational in that sense.
It's fascinating work. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Mike. Nice to talk with you.
Absolutely. And if for people that want to learn more, they can find you at the University of Oregon. You're easily found. And I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thanks a lot. Nice to talk to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.